Hi, everyone. This is a brief account of an argument that I made in a paper that I published back in 2012 called Duties Regarding Nature, a Kantian Approach to Environmental Ethics. So that was published in the Kant Yearbook. I'll have a link below. And the paper makes the case that Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy is much more conducive to environmental concern than is typically supposed by both critics and friends of Kant. So what I call the traditional or orthodox interpretation of Kant holds that we should avoid cruelty to animals, for example, and what he calls wanton destruction of nature, solely because those actions make us more likely to fail in our duties to humans. So the claim would be something like there's a psychological tendency in human beings to, say, if you get in the habit of being cruel to animals, torturing animals for fun or something like that as a child, that can mess you up and make you more likely to be cruel to humans, for example, which would fail when it comes to your obligations to humans. So Kant famously, of course, is all about respect and thinks that we ought to respect other human beings as ends in themselves. They're rational persons, autonomous, and all that stuff. But non-human animals, which I'll just say animals from here on out, lack those properties. So in Kant's fairly demanding notion of rationality, non-human animals are not rational beings. They don't have autonomy, so they're importantly different from persons. So on this traditional interpretation, you have what's known as a direct duty to respect human beings because they're rational persons. But you don't have any direct duties towards non-human animals because they're not rational. And we'll leave aside why, for now, rationality is so important in Kant's account of morality, and specifically when it comes to why we have duties to certain entities and not to others. Nonetheless, in a few places, Kant does discuss what he calls duties regarding non-humans. And this is where the duty not to be cruel to animals and the duty not to wantonly destroy nature come in. These duties are what he calls indirect duties regarding non-human entities. So it involves them, of course. We have a duty not to be cruel to animals, but that ultimately boils down to a duty that we have to human beings. And as I said, the traditional interpretation and a common criticism of Kant, especially among philosophers who are sympathetic to the idea of animal rights or to some kind of moral concern for animals, or in the case of environmental philosophy, also for non-animal nature. A common criticism from people in those areas is that Kant can't account for the supposedly obvious fact that we really do have direct duties to animals and to the rest of nature. And they think, well, it's pretty weak to say that you shouldn't be cruel to them simply because it makes us more likely to be, say, cruel to humans. That may be true psychologically, at least for some people, though the extent to which it's true is, I think, an open question. But even if it is true, the criticism is that that's just too weak. It doesn't fit with our intuition that there's just something inherently wrong with, say, lighting a cat on fire, to take a well-known philosophical example. That's just simply wrong in itself, you might think. And it's wrong because of what it does to the cat. It violates some right that the cat has, or if you don't believe in rights, it at least violates some obligation we have not to do that kind of thing to anyone or to anything. So the orthodox or traditional interpretation is that, well, if Kant has any room for concern for non-humans in his moral philosophy, it's of a very weak variety and arguably misses the point, because it comes back to how we regard humans and how we treat humans, and animals are sort of just incidental in that whole story. Right? They happen to be involved, but we don't owe them anything directly on this traditional view of what Kant's arguing. So in the paper, I make the case that that Kant's argument is actually much stronger and has more to recommend it to those who have concerns for animals and the rest of nature than the traditional interpretation can allow. So the first thing to notice is that when Kant talks about indirect duties are not really some kind of second class of duty. They're ultimately direct duties themselves. The indirect part is just the fact that sometimes direct duties are indirectly owed. Right? So they take a sort of detour through some third party. So let's take a pretty clear example. I have an indirect duty regarding your property because ultimately I have a direct duty to you. So my duty to respect you and to treat you as an equal, for example, requires, to some extent at least, that I respect your property rights. So it would be wrong for me to come in and break the windows on your house, not because I owe anything to the windows, right? Not because I'm doing something wrong to the house, but because I'm doing something wrong to you. So if you like, you can say, I have an indirect duty regarding your house, but that indirect duty is really just a direct duty that's owed to you. It just requires me not to do certain things to your house, right? Not to damage it for no good reason. So one mistake that is easy to make, and that I think sometimes the traditional or orthodox interpretation of Kant does make, is to assume that indirect duties are a different class of duty from direct duties, and that these indirect duties, as a discrete set of duties, are weak and easily overridden. So you might think, well, it's just an indirect duty; it's not that important, so it doesn't really require much of my attention. But that's not really the case. So as we've just seen, indirect duties are ultimately direct duties. The indirect aspect is just the fact that sometimes direct duties are indirectly owed, right? They take a detour through some third party. So whether it's your home, a piece of property, whether it's an animal in Kant's case, the indirect duty does not somehow make the duty less important and doesn't somehow make it more open to being ignored than a direct duty. So that's one thing to notice. Second thing to notice is that on Kant's account, the direct duty that he spends the most time talking about when it comes to his comments on non-human nature, which admittedly are fairly brief in his work, but when he does talk about that issue, the direct duty he has in mind is a duty one has to oneself. And specifically, it's what he calls a direct duty to increase one's own moral perfection. So moral perfection is kind of an old-fashioned term, but basically it means to improve your moral character. This largely involves the cultivation of virtues. So what are the virtues? Well, might be things like justice, benevolence, things like that. These are dispositions of character. So Kant talks of them as being sort of dispositions to action, right? So the benevolent person is someone who is disposed towards being kind to others, right, and promoting their well-being. A just person is someone who is disposed towards seeing that justice is done in the way that they deal with other persons. And conversely, a vice would be a disposition of character that runs contrary to our duties. So injustice or malevolence, something like that. Those dispositions might make it more or less likely that we'll succeed in fulfilling our duties, whatever those are. But that's a separate point from Kant's claim that there is, in and of itself, a direct duty that the human being owes to herself to enhance her moral perfection. Um, so, so what does that mean? It means that Kant thinks I owe it to myself, morally speaking, not as something that's just in my own self-interest, but something that I owe to myself out of self-respect, to cultivate virtues and to root out vices. So to become a better person in terms of the kind of disposition that I have. So to become a more just person, a more benevolent person. Let's stick with those two examples. Now, having the virtue or the disposition of, say, benevolence doesn't guarantee that one will always act in benevolent ways. It makes it more likely, perhaps, that I will do so. But I could generally be a benevolent person, but I'm having a bad day and I do something that's cruel to somebody else, right? And that's, you might say, out of character. I don't normally do that, but I did on this day, and that was wrong. I ought not to have done that. But the fact of whether or not I'm benevolent in terms of my disposition of character versus whether I always act benevolently, those are two distinct issues. So if, like Kant, he makes this argument in his Metaphysics of Morals, specifically the section of that book known as the Doctrine of Virtue, if, like Kant, you think that we have a direct duty to cultivate virtues in ourselves to enhance our moral perfection, then that, importantly, is a duty in its own right. That's something that we ought to do regardless of how those virtues may or may not help us in terms of acting in accordance with our other duties. So Kant makes the argument that cruel treatment of animals, for example, is, he says, intimately opposed to a duty one has to oneself. And again, this is in the Doctrine of Virtue. And if we read the relevant passage carefully and make the argument in more detail in the paper, but if we read that passage carefully, it's pretty evident that Kant isn't merely saying that, well, you better abstain from cruelty to animals because that makes it more likely that you'll fail in your duties to humans. He doesn't say just that. That might be true, but he also says that the cruelty in and of itself to animals is intimately opposed to a duty that one has to oneself. So it's pretty clear from that Kant thinks that cruelty to animals is generally wrong. We ought not to do it. The explanation for why ultimately comes back to a duty one has to oneself. So this has led some people to make the, I think, mistaken assumption that Kant's view is just that cruelty to animals makes us more likely to be cruel to humans, and therefore we should avoid it if we can. But I think we can see that it's much stronger than just that. So why might cruelty to animals be opposed to a duty to oneself to enhance her own moral perfection? Let's again take benevolence as a virtue. In Kant's interpretation of what a virtue is, that would be a disposition of character. If I'm a benevolent person, then I don't want to act in ways that are contrary to that. And one reason I wouldn't want to do that is because cruel actions will erode what virtue I do have. Although it's possible to be a benevolent person in general and commit a cruel act once in a while, at some point, you can't make that claim anymore, right? If I'm routinely cruel to anyone or anything, I can't say, well, really deep down, I'm a benevolent person. I just almost never act like it. We would have good grounds for doubting the sincerity of that person, or we might think that they believe that, but they're just deceived about themselves. Maybe it's just wishful thinking. So this opens the way to the plausible thought that repeated cruel treatment of animals will eventually completely erode, or at least largely erode, many of the virtues that human beings might have. this would be opposed to the duty one has to increase their own moral perfection, for the simple reason that doing things that are opposed to that duty, things that actually weaken our moral perfection, would be wrong. So I try to make the argument in the paper that if we take Kant's view seriously and read him a bit more carefully, the implication seems to be that it's inherently wrong to cause, as I argue, unnecessary harm to non-human organisms, because doing that, by its very nature, erodes our moral perfection. It damages what virtue we have in our character and tends to develop vices. So I might become a malevolent person if I'm continuously cruel to animals. So I ought not to do that. It's not just advice that I should abstain from cruelty, because that might make it harder for me to be moral in the cases that really matter, say humans. But rather, Kant's arguing that that cruelty is in and of itself wrong because of how it damages my own character. Now, you might think that this is still too weak. Some people will still want some sort of stronger moral account of why animals and the rest of nature matter. So again, Kant's not going to say that we have direct duties to those entities. But we might ask, what's really lost in adopting an indirect duty approach to environmental ethics? So to thinking about our treatment of non-human organisms as requiring certain things, pretty strong requirements. For example, on my view, not to cause them unnecessary harm, which if we took that seriously would require us to make pretty massive changes in society, right? To, for example, stop using animals for food, arguably. The explanation for why we would have a duty for that would ultimately come down in our theoretical story to a duty one has to oneself. But practically speaking, it may not be all that distinguishable from other forms of environmental concern. So say you attribute rights to non-human organisms. That, of course, would also presumably give us a reason not to use them for food, or not to use at least animals for food. And theoretically, it would be very different from the Kantian approach that I've just sketched out here. But practically speaking, if the end result is that it's wrong to harm animals for no good reason, whether that is due to their having rights or whether that's due to harming them being opposed to this duty to oneself to cultivate virtue, the end result seems to be the same. So you might wonder, what's the problem with an indirect duty view? It sounds unwelcome to some people because indirect duty sounds pretty weak. But once we look more closely and remember that, well, an indirect duty is really just a direct duty that's indirectly owed. And if we look more closely to the claim that cruel treatment of animals and wanton destruction of non-animal nature, as Kant says, those actions are intimately opposed to that duty to oneself. I think the building blocks are there for a pretty strong set of protections for non-human organisms. I mean, of course, that doesn't mean humans will take those duties seriously or anything, but that's already the case. We're pretty good at not doing that. But the framework is there for why we should care about non-human animals. And one last thing I want to mention is that we should think carefully about what it means to cultivate virtues with respect to non-human natural organisms. So a genuine virtue of benevolence, for example, requires that I genuinely care about the well-being of others. And apparently, it seems pretty clear at least, human beings aren't the only creatures in the world that have a well-being. Pretty clearly, many non-human animals have that too. They can be harmed or benefited by our actions. And arguably, the same is true even for non-animal organisms. So, destroying plant life, for example, you can make a case, although it's a bit more controversial, that that's harmful to those organisms that are affected. So, damaging and destroying trees, for example, is reasonably enough taken to be harmful to the trees. So keeping that in mind and remembering that benevolence requires genuine concern for the well-being of others, this too opens the way for a Kantian approach to environmental thinking that genuinely cares about the welfare of non-human organisms. So on the view that I develop, just sketched out briefly in the article, but more fully developed in a book I later came out with that we can talk about at a different time, I make the argument that Kant's moral philosophy either requires or very strongly suggests what's known as what I call an environmental virtue ethic. So the idea that we should cultivate environmental virtues, which is to say character traits that are morally good, but which specifically involve or are oriented towards non-human organisms. So again, back to the idea that cruel treatment of animals is intimately opposed to a duty to ourself, that duty being a duty to cultivate virtues. One effective way to cultivate such virtues is to care about the well-being of non-human nature. Again, our example of benevolence. Of course, I can cultivate benevolence with respect to human beings through kindness and consideration of their interests and things like that. But it seems that I could also do that with respect to animals. I could consider their interests, what's harmful for them and try to avoid that, and what's beneficial for them and try and pursue things of that nature. So in short, although Kant himself on the whole wasn't a virtue ethicist, virtue plays an important role in his moral philosophy, and specifically when it comes to non-rational entities like animals and plants. I think that his approach offers a promising starting point, at least, for caring about the well-being of non-humans for their own sake. And now you can see we're getting even closer to what environmentalists and animal welfare advocates would want. The theoretical story as to why we get there or how we get there, it will be very different from the traditional ways of doing so. But it's at least very plausible to think that Kant's moral philosophy, especially in the Doctrine of Virtue, is much friendlier to environmental ethics and animal ethics than the critics suppose. Okay, so like I said, that's a very brief overview. There's a lot more that could be said, but I'll leave it there for now. Hope you enjoyed. Talk to you next time.